Well, thank you for downloading another episode of Your Life Simplified. My name is George Fernandez, and I'll be your host for this episode. On today's episode, we're talking about one of my favorite topics. That's collecting. It probably goes without saying that people can collect just about anything. In fact, if you can see it, touch it, smell it, or even taste it, you can probably collect it. So no matter what you collect, it doesn't necessarily mean that what you collect actually accrues in value. What may be valuable to you may not necessarily be valuable to the next person, such as a family heirloom you've inherited. But in those rare cases you did inherit something unique, like in an episode of Strange Inheritances, it's important to understand what you should do. And of course, sometimes you may want to be more intentional about what you're collecting, so we'll talk a little bit about that too. So today we're going to focus our attention on helping you distinguish between what collectibles have value, and if so, how to properly manage those collections. So we have our guest, Laura Doyle, Art and Jewelry and Valuable Collections Manager from Chubb Insurance, here with us today. Laura, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Laura, it's great to have you here. Certainly I have my own passion that I place on collecting, and so I'm curious to understand how you got started in helping folks take care of their valuable collections.
Sure. So I had studied art history and business and really wanted to find a career at the intersection of the two. So in college, I had the opportunity to work at a regional auction house, which was a great experience in terms of getting exposure to a wide range of objects and insight into valuation. Then after graduating, I had worked for a private collector, which was another great opportunity to be hands-on with a collection. So ultimately, that process of managing and protecting a collection and all of the logistics that go into it were of interest to me. And I found my way at that point into art insurance. And at Chubb, our clients include successful families and individuals, and they range from, people that are just starting to collect up to some of the largest collections in the world. So our goal is to help those clients protect and manage their collections, whatever the objects might be.
Well, that's really fascinating, Laura. It's really great to hear stories about how people get started in their careers. And one of the things, whenever you're able to connect your passion to what you do each and every day. So we think about collecting. Maybe we can start off with just talking about it in general terms. My guess is you've seen a lot of different types of collections over the years, and I'm curious to understand why the fascination with collecting. Why does it exist? Why do people collect?
Oh, that's a great question. I've spoken to so many of our clients who collect because they are so driven by a passion for these objects. And in many cases, it's like a disease. They can't stop buying. And in some cases, that's why they, have more objects than they have space in their home. And we start to see a lot of them using storage facilities to house some of those objects. But there's no limit to what you can collect. We have clients who collect everything from blue chip artwork to antique weather vanes to whiskey. And again, it's really because they have such a passion for those objects, and in many cases, a really high level of connoisseurship. It's just something that they are really driven to find these objects. And I would say in some cases, we also have collectors who are looking at the investment potential of some of these objects. And then, of course, there's people that are looking at both, objects from a passion and an investment perspective.
Yeah, I can certainly understand that. I've always been fascinated with science fiction art and comic books for a number of years. In fact, I also collect vinyl. My vinyl collection is just really for me to enjoy, sit back and listen from time to time. But what's interesting is I was just talking to one of my daughters who also loves comics, and we were just having this conversation about stepping it up and actually looking at early editions of specific comics and maybe building a collection that holds value or actually potentially increases in value. And so do you find that common for folks to kind of shift gears like that?
We do see that. I think some collectors are very strategic with what they're buying. They start out because it's such a passion, and then they might have been lucky enough to buy something, when the artist market was at a lower point, and then they're able to, realize significant profit on some pieces if that market has gone up. So I think that they, in some cases, are really interested in that potential for growth. But in the end, we always tell clients, you never know what's going to happen. Make sure that you're buying what you love, so you won't be disappointed in the end if you don't end up making a profit on something. You can always enjoy something aesthetically, even if it's not appreciating monetarily.
Yeah, so that's a really great point. You also said something a little bit earlier about blue chip art. Can you help me understand what blue chip art is?
Mhm. So blue chip art would really be pieces that, are works by artists that are very established, the most valuable works of art. And so that would be artists like Picasso and Jackson Pollock, Mark Roscoe. Um, those are artists that have a body of work that is, very well represented in museum collections, major collections, and those pieces tend to drive some of the highest values in the market. So pieces that are blue chip would really be by a well recognized artist, and that command a really high value.
So it is fascinating and interesting to find out why people collect over time. So when we start thinking about the next level of collecting, where people start assigning value to collectibles, help us understand what makes something valuable.
hmm That's a great question. There are a number of factors that can impact the value of an object. Obviously, who the artist or who the maker is, the condition of that item, and how rare the object is. But also things like provenance. Provenance is the ownership history of an item. So that would mean, who's owned it, where has it been exhibited, where has it been bought and sold. And if something has an interesting provenance, that can significantly impact the value. So, for example, items that were previously owned by a celebrity or by royalty tend to sell for a premium. Just this past year, Sotheby's auctioned a diamond and pearl pendant that was owned by Marie Antoinette. It had an estimate before the sale of 1 to 2 million, and that item ended up selling for over 36 million. Obviously, because of that provenance coming out of Marie Antoinette's collection. So there's a number of factors that can impact the value.
Wow, that's incredible. And I imagine the person selling that was very excited about that. I also just recently read, and keep going back to my comic books. As you can tell, I probably am a little bit of a fan. I was just reading an article about, an early edition comic book, and you mentioned the concept of provenance. And that's a really important piece because in this particular comic book, it sold for much, much more because it was owned by the person who bought it when it was first issued. And it had been held in this person's collection or personal belongings for more than 70 years. The fact that it didn't get sold and resold actually added value to it. So I think it's really kind of interesting how kind of all this stuff works.
Absolutely. Yeah, another one like that. I mean, also like Jackie O's costume pearls. Those are something she probably bought for under $100. Those ended up selling at auction for over 200,000. Again, because they were coming out of Jackie O's collection.
That's incredible. So I guess when you look at this, and you mentioned the auctions you have to go to, and obviously the folks that are bidding on these, they're driving some of that value because they're willing to pay for it. So if I'm new to collecting, let's say I go to one of these auctions and want to consider making a purchase, how can I go and be better informed? What should I do or what should I know before I attempt to go into an auction house like that?
Well, it's important to do your research. So you want to understand, if you are buying a work of art, you want to understand that artist market. Historically, where have their items sold and at what levels? So you can certainly, go visit galleries. We always tell collectors before you commit to a purchase, just look as much as you can. Go to museums, go to galleries, understand, what really interests you. When you're in the galleries, dealers are very open and willing to talk about the items that they're selling. So ask them questions, find out about, the artist's inspiration, if they've ever been exhibited anywhere, get as much information as you can. And then when it comes to auctions, auction records are public information. So for the most part, auction houses, especially the larger auction houses, will have websites that list databases of past sales. So you can actually research what similar items by the artists that you're interested in have sold for in the past. So I always recommend doing a lot of research on that pricing before you go into an auction, because it's easy to get caught up in the excitement of that. And you want to make sure that you're making an educated purchase.
So you've just described what it takes to make a purchase at an auction. So let's flip it on its head a little bit. You hear those stories about people going into their parents' attic after they pass, and they're cleaning it out, and they come across something they think might have some value to it. What happens in that case? How do you do the research on that?
Similar. So if you're inheriting something, I always recommend if there's any type of documentation that comes with those items in terms of, invoices, artist fact sheets, prior appraisals, whatever documentation that might be affiliated with those items, make sure you hold on to that. Because again, that can be part of the provenance and that can really help to support evaluation. So there are a ton of great resources online. And I always recommend that collectors reach out to an appraiser. There are three main appraisal organizations, which are the Appraisers Association of America, the American Society of Appraisers, and the International Society of Appraisers. All of those organizations have experts in-house who specialize in different genres. So you've got people who are, sports memorabilia experts or pop cultural memorabilia or fine and decorative art experts. And they have, a certain level of education, experience with the market, and they're great resources to be able to come in and really help you understand, what you have, what was inherited, and what the potential value of those items are. So you can reach out to any of those experts, and certainly that's something that I would recommend, to make sure that you're working with someone that is, reputable and has the requisite educational background to really be, commenting on those pieces.
Thanks again for downloading this episode of Your Life Simplified, which is produced by Mariner Wealth Advisors. And at Mariner Wealth Advisors, we're here to serve as your advocate. We help people chart a course to reach their personal and financial goals so that they can have greater peace of mind that may lead to a more fulfilling life. We do this by always putting our clients first. Because as fiduciaries, we're required to provide guidance that's in the best interest of clients, not in the best interest of a company or shareholders or anyone else. So as you listen to this podcast and have questions about maybe your own financial situation, or would simply like a second opinion, or even you have an idea for a future podcast, please go ahead and email us at podcast@marinerwealthadvisors.com. If you found the information on this podcast valuable, please go ahead and share it with a friend or family member that you think might benefit from this information. And please don't forget to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss an episode. Thanks for listening, and now back to the episode. Okay, so we've done our research. I have a general idea of what something might be worth. Maybe it's a baseball card that's signed by Mickey Mantle, or it's a painting, or it's a car that I inherited from my grandfather who's had it for 75 years, something along those lines. But it's a collection I've had over time, and it's accrued in value. I'm guessing I would want to protect that. And I know this is what you work with every day. So what does that look like? Can you walk me through the process of how you go about protecting that collection? And is it different depending upon what kind of item in that it is?
Yes. So we really look at protection in terms of both the physical protection of the asset and then the financial protection. When it comes to physical protection, there are, obviously certain things that need to be done based on the object and the material, and certain things are more sensitive than other objects. But in general, once you have a valuable item to protect it, you should think about things like environmental controls as one of the most important things. So that means lighting, temperature, humidity. You don't want a work on paper or a photograph, which are two materials that are really light sensitive, to be overly exposed to either natural or artificial lighting, because those objects can fade. That's irreversible damage, and that can really impact the value. And when it comes to temperature and humidity, museum standards typically call for 70 degrees and about 50% humidity, which in some cases can be difficult to maintain at a private residence versus a museum. But really the key there is to make sure that there's not rapid fluctuations. So you don't want the temperature and humidity levels changing within a short period of time and sort of a rapid progression, because that can actually weaken the object or even lead to mold growth on that piece. We also always tell collectors, be mindful of where you're installing objects. You generally would like to avoid installing items directly under bathrooms or water lines, or even air vents that could eventually leak. And then you want to be thinking about things like burglar alarms and smoke detectors, and having that comprehensive protection in place, really from a fire and burglar perspective, to safeguard those objects. And then when it comes to financial protection, I always recommend to collectors that you want to be updating appraisals on a regular basis so that you always have a clear understanding of the value of the item. And then, of course, we always recommend insuring those pieces so that you're protected against financial loss in the event an object is damaged or stolen. So those two pieces really go hand in hand, getting updated appraisals done, making sure that you're insuring for that value, and then making sure that the item is, physically protected wherever it's going to be stored or displayed.
So when you say you should have the appraisals done on a regular basis, can you help me understand that a little bit? Is that really every year or only when the market has changed? What's the actual frequency?
So we typically recommend 3 to 5 years, but again, that can really vary based on what the object is. Some items increase in value much more quickly. So for example, post-war art, contemporary art, those are two market segments that historically have increased fairly rapidly. And so for some items, we'll recommend that clients have those appraised every 1 to 3 years so that they can stay in line with those market fluctuations. But then there's other market segments which have really been flat in recent years. So, for example, decorative arts and antiques, which is known in the trade as brown furniture. Unfortunately, that's a market segment that just really hasn't appreciated. Part of that has to do with just changing tastes and what people are collecting now, and what younger generations are really interested in buying. And so some of these large antique pieces just really aren't as marketable. And so we typically recommend having those appraised maybe every 5 to 10 years, just because they're really not fluctuating in value. And in some cases, those objects have actually gone down in value in recent years.
It's very interesting. So when you think of theft, I'm thinking that it's probably a different issue if you have a signed baseball sitting on the shelf or on a desk, or a family heirloom sitting on a shelf somewhere, even a painting hanging on the wall, versus a large piece of antique furniture. So how common is theft?
It's fairly common. It's not the most common source of loss. The most common source of loss is actually damage in transit, followed by water loss. But we do see theft happen on a regular basis. And to your point, it's not going to be, the really large armoire. It's typically smaller, more portable items. Theft happens most frequently with jewelry when you're talking about collectible items. So it's really important that collectors are, cognizant of what type of security and protection they have in their house. And then anytime they're traveling with items, if you're bringing jewelry on vacation, if you are going to be traveling with pieces, you need to make sure that you keep those, on your person, either wearing the items or in a bag that you're holding, or that you are storing them in the hotel vault, not the in-room safe, which can be fairly easy to access. So really just being aware of your surroundings and really what you're traveling with.
Sure.
And when it comes to jewelry, we actually have a number of clients that will have replica pieces created that are essentially imitations, not the real thing, for when they're traveling, so that they, can feel like they're traveling with jewelry, but they're not bringing their most expensive pieces. And when objects are stolen, I think, some people have this concept of the black market for artwork and things sort of disappearing into collections. But the reality of it is that once an object is stolen, it can be very difficult to resell. There's a number of databases that track lost and stolen objects. The FBI maintains one, Interpol, the Art Loss Register, and a number of other databases that are online. And those databases are accessible and searchable by the public. Most reputable galleries and dealers and auction houses are always going to check those databases. So before they would accept a consignment, which would mean, accepting something to sell, they're going to run the piece through those databases just to make sure that there are no title issues and the object was not stolen at some point. So if you have an object that's stolen, and especially if it's insured, that piece is always going to be reported to one of those databases. And then those companies, the private companies, are really constantly tracking and combing through listings of artwork to make sure that none of those pieces flagged as being stolen are actually listed on those databases.
So after something has been stolen, how often do you recover it? Is it common?
You know what? It can take years in some cases. In 2016, we actually recovered a Norman Rockwell painting that had been stolen from our client in 1976. So that was a 40-year, time frame between the piece being stolen and recovered. So I would say when objects are stolen, and in many cases, it can be years before those pieces are tracked down.
Got it. So you said that it's important to be mindful of where you actually put them. So what kind of things have you seen in your experience on perhaps things not being put in the right place? What's happened to them?
So we have seen everything. I would say, there have been a number of losses from clients who have hung paintings over fireplaces that they are actively using, and that
Oh gosh.
results in both, smoke and soot damage to the surface. But also the heat from, the flue in the wall behind can actually start to impact the stretcher of the canvas and start to distort those works. So we've seen losses from that. We've seen clients who have installed artwork near air vents, and along the same lines, if there's hot air coming out of an air vent or cold air, and that can result in moisture. So we've seen losses where, the fluctuation in temperature there has impacted the piece, as well as water dripping down onto canvases. And then another common cause of loss would be pieces that are installed in really high traffic areas. So if you have, a work of art that's installed near a doorway or in a narrow hallway, pieces that are just more susceptible to accidental damage from getting bumped into, or if you have, young children that might be really active and in that area, brushing up against pieces, and that's caused surface damage.
So does crayon coloring on top of a piece cause a loss too?
Yeah, we had a loss a few years ago where our client's toddler took a marker to a
Oh
very
my.
valuable piece of contemporary art that was really large format. So it was installed fairly close to the ground, all the way up to the ceiling. So it was very easily accessible to him.
Oh my. That's pretty frightening to me. That's really why I stick to these low level collections so I don't have to worry too much about that. Although I have to admit, I would be pretty upset if one of my kids scratched one of my records.
I mean, even from pets, we have seen both cats and dogs that have impacted artwork and decorative art collections. We had a client who had a large, I think it was a lab or a golden retriever, and the tail ended up swinging into a Tiffany lamp, and knocking that to the ground. So I would say just think about kind of your lifestyle and what makes sense to collect and where those objects are located when you're thinking about protection.
Yeah, that's a really great point. I think I will just recommend that you don't have pets or kids if you're going to collect anything. Just kidding, of course. So when you look at collecting, there are going to be times you're going to be purchasing things from across the country. And I would imagine that there's a certain process you have to go through to actually move it to you as well. Is that correct?
Right, exactly. So you don't want to be rolling up your canvas and shipping it, through FedEx or UPS. There are trained art handlers who are available to pack and ship artwork, and all types of valuable collections. So we always recommend working with a professional. They've got expertise in handling valuable and fragile objects, and they understand how to properly pack and crate those pieces so that they'll be very secured when they're in transit. And then, in addition, those shippers would obviously have trucks that have climate controls and air ride suspension, and in many cases, also GPS tracking and security systems, which is something to think about if you're shipping high value pieces, particularly if those items are going long distance. So shipping is always a really critical aspect of the collecting life cycle. After you buy something, got collectors that will buy online or buy at auction, and they might not be there in person. And so that piece is going to be shipped to them, in some cases cross country or internationally. So you really want to understand the chain of custody and how those pieces will be protected as they're being packed and shipped.
So when you say chain of custody, you really mean ensuring that it's handled properly.
Exactly. And a lot of shippers will only operate in kind of a regional area. Not all shippers will go cross country when it comes to, art shippers. And so in some cases, they will actually subcontract out transit to a third party. So you always want to understand, is the company that you're hiring doing the transit from point A to B, or are they subcontracting out to a third party? And if so, who is that party, and are they maintaining the same controls? We had several years ago a client that was shipping a valuable collection of wine from the Northeast down to his residence in Florida. And the company that he had hired ended up subcontracting that transit out to a third party. And it turns out that that third party did not have refrigerated trucks. As you can imagine, wine is very sensitive to any changes in temperature and humidity, and going from the Northeast down to the hot, humid climate of Florida ended up destroying all of the wine.
Oh my gosh, that's just awful to think about if you're the one who had that collection. It kind of makes me think of another story, and I think I actually heard this from you at an event where you were speaking. You were sharing a story about this British street artist, Banksy, I think was the name. Can you share that story? I was fascinated by that story, and then I have a question afterward.
Yeah, so Banksy is an anonymous street artist based in the UK. There's been a lot of series about who he actually is over the years, but he's never publicly identified himself. A lot of the works that he does are stenciled onto public buildings, and oftentimes, social and political commentary is kind of the theme of those pieces. But he's a really interesting artist, and some of his works are actually done on canvas. So last fall, one of his canvases had come up for auction at Sotheby's in London. And it was this interesting piece called Love is in the Air. It's stenciled work of a young girl holding a balloon that was a heart, and it was kind of lifting up into the air. So that item was sold at auction, and the auctioneer hammered down the gavel. And as soon as they hammered down the gavel, the piece, which had been mounted on the wall in this sort of ornate gilded gold frame, the piece started beeping. There was this beeping sound, and all of a sudden the canvas fell through the frame and came out the bottom of the frame in shredded pieces of canvas. So there was a shredder that was built into the frame, unbeknownst to everyone that was in the room bidding on this piece. So there are a ton of YouTube videos out there. It's a really interesting thing to see, kind of mouse agape watching this happen. Nothing like this has ever happened in an auction room. And so it turns out that Banksy had built into this frame this shredder, and the piece transformed during the sale. He actually renamed it from Love is in the Air to Love is in the Bin. And the piece, if you look at it now, it essentially is sort of halfway through the frame with these shreds of canvas hanging out of the bottom.
So is it worth more before or after it was shredded?
I got that question from a lot of clients, and this is an interesting piece. This is essentially a performance piece, and This was always his intention to have this done. So our opinion, and I think this is broadly the opinion of art appraisers, is that the piece is now worth more than it was previously. And again, it goes back to that idea of the history of the piece, the provenance, the fact that this event was so public and well documented. Absolutely, this piece is more valuable than it was before. And in fact, the new collector is obviously going to keep it and display it in this new current format. This is not a piece that you would ever have conserved because technically it's not damaged.
Right. Well, yeah, I do find that story very interesting. Well, thanks again, Laura. I really appreciate you being with me today. This has been really helpful. And as I shared before, I have a passion about this topic. And I know you have a busy schedule, so I really do appreciate you being here.
Thank you.
Before we close out our show today, I want to thank you for listening and quickly mention that if you do have questions about today's podcast or any other podcasts that we have, be sure to let us know at podcast@marinerwealthadvisors.com. So as I mentioned, Laura has some great tips for us to share with you about how to take care of your valuables and your collections, and you can find those at marinerwealthadvisors.com/podcast. Thanks again for listening, and don't forget to subscribe.
Mariner LLC, doing business as Mariner Wealth Advisors, or MWA, is an SEC registered investment advisor. Registration of an investment advisor does not imply a certain level of skill or training. MWA is in compliance with the current notice filing requirements imposed upon registered investment advisors by those states in which MWA maintains clients. MWA may only transact business in those states in which a notice has been filed or qualifies for an exemption or exclusion from notice filing requirements. Any subsequent direct communication by MWA with a prospective client shall be conducted by a representative that is either registered or qualifies for an exemption or exclusion from registration in the state where the prospective client resides. For additional information about MWA, including fees and services, please contact MWA or refer to the Investment Advisor Public Disclosure website at www.advisorinfo.sec.gov. Please read the disclosure statement carefully before you invest or send money.